Well, the Times is calling itself South Africa's first interactive newspaper, and recently Mandlakazi chatted to Colin Daniels from the newspaper to find out more about new media strategies.
Colin, thank you for coming through and joining us today.
Thanks for having me on the show.
How has the adoption of new media affected the industry as a whole?
Well, I think if you look at it globally, it's had a dramatic effect. I think we're starting to see a shift from people consuming their media in a traditional print fashion and a broadcast fashion to moving online to consume their news and information and to communicate with one another. And
where are we as South African publications?
As South African publications, we've still got a bit of work to do. A lot of people say that we're roughly about 5 years behind, say, the US and Europe in terms of how advanced our publications are. But we're definitely catching on, and it's exciting to see.
And what about the rest of Africa, Colin?
The rest of Africa, I would say, is even further behind the rest of the world, and I think you can attribute this largely to the fact that internet penetration is so low in Africa, and to a certain extent in South Africa. And I think until that starts to increase, we're still going to see, there being a digital divide, so to speak.
Now, how has this affected our newsrooms?
Well, at the moment, there is no right model, to be honest with you. I think even if you look internationally, the Washington Post, the New York Times, they've built their newsrooms into so-called convergent newsrooms, where traditional print reporters and videographers and podcasters sit amongst each other. And in this country, I think a lot of the media companies are still trying to pinpoint a proper digital strategy. Jonic Communications, where I work, for example, the Times newsroom is considered to be a convergent newsroom, and it's a big cultural shift, especially for existing journalists and media practitioners. But it's something that we're still trying to get our heads around, and I think there is no right model, but we're going to start to see more and more bigger emphasis placed on this in the future.
Talking about journalists, do we have the skills to be able to feed these platforms?
I think there is a bit of a skills shortage. I think we've got some fantastic journalists in this country, and I think all it comes down to is a bit of extra additional training. I also think that it's also a mindset and a cultural sort of shift that needs to take place, and that's why I think our younger journalists, the journalists that are now being trained in our journalism and graduate schools, are going to be the ones that are really going to take this new media, the video cameras and audio recorders, and go out and start making multimedia. And also, likewise, the youth are the ones that are going to consume it to start off with. They're the early adopters. Generally.
I want us to talk about how financially it is impacted on the whole publication industry, new media. Advertisers, how are they reacting to new media?
I think, unfortunately, they're reacting a tiny bit slower than a lot of us would like them to be reacting. I think, in South Africa especially, there's still a lot of ad spend is put into newspapers and the traditional media. I think it is growing. Every year it's growing, but we're still quite a bit behind. I think when broadband penetration rates start to increase, and I see that happening in a big way leading up to 2010, I think we'll start to see more and more money going into online advertising and new media products.
Now, what do the trends show? When are people online reading newspapers, for instance?
Well, once again, in South Africa, it's different to the rest of the world. What we've seen is that a lot of people consume their online media either in the morning or during lunchtime. So what that implies is that they're consuming this during work hours, probably in the workspace. Which
leads to my next question. There's this perception that it's much cheaper to read your newspaper online rather than buying the actual publication. What are the cost effects?
Well, if we look at that sort of anecdotal evidence, we would say that there's a huge impact on corporates and on their bandwidth spend, especially with there being, bandwidth per meg is very expensive in this country, as we know. And I think it's a huge impact on corporates, on their bandwidth fees, and more companies are actually blocking access to certain sites like YouTube and Facebook and MySpace, the so-called social networking sites, social media sites, because of the cost. I think that, you know, internationally, there's more of a shift to consuming after working hours because people have bandwidth at home. And it's still, of course, not free. I mean, the publication itself might be free or whatever they're consuming, but, you know, the cost carries over into your internet fees.
Colin, thank you very much for your time.